I'm Christoph von Tomme, and welcome to the API Resilience podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for. Welcome to the API Resilience podcast. I'm really excited to have Paul Coinaud today as my guest. He's a senior manager of documentation at ANSYS, which is now part of Synopsys, a major acquisition that happened last year. He's responsible not only for the developer portal, but also for a part of the product documentation. He's a very experienced technical writer that goes way back in the DITA community. In fact, I learned in Brussels earlier this year that he was one of the pioneers of DITA in the French community. So I'm very excited to be talking with Paul about the evolution of all of this, what we're going through, how he ended up being involved in developer portals and developer documentation, and also to talk a little bit about minimalism and what's the right balance between DITA and Markdown and all of that good stuff, and maybe some of the new formats that are coming up. But with that short introduction, welcome, Paul. I'm very happy to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Christoph. Thanks for having me. I
was really surprised that you're one of the pioneers for DITA inside of France, like one of the first people to start adopting DITA. Did I understand that correctly? Can you maybe tell a little bit more about how that all started and what is your history with DITA?
Sure. Yeah, time flies. It's been almost 20 years since I learned about DITA for the first time. I think it was back in 2007. I was hired by a company who wanted to reduce their translation costs mainly, and also to structure a little bit better what they were doing in terms of documentation. And I think my manager at the time was some visionary person because he learned about XML and also about DITA, which was very new at the time. And I don't know how many people knew DITA in 2007 in France, but not many. And so I read the book, I exercised myself with Oxygen, XML editor, and basically learned by doing and by myself. And that's where we started with DITA. We implemented a CMS, the content management system at the time. And I can really say that we really saved a lot of, not time, because it took quite a lot of time to do the transition between unstructured content, but we saved a lot of money in translation costs. I remember having something in mind between 300,000 and 400,000 euros per year. So the return on investment was easy to justify and to calculate at least. So and then I started to teach DITA at the university, and this is where, and I think with other people with similar profiles as mine, also started to teach DITA at the time. So progressively, 15 years ago, I would say, many students were aware about what DITA is. And also vendors very much implemented DITA into their solutions. So that's where it became popular.
So what university was that you were teaching at?
So I started with Limoges. It's actually where I was trained myself, but not on DITA because at the time it was not a thing. It's in the center of France. And then I moved and I changed jobs a few times, and I moved to south of France and I started to teach DITA there in Nice on the French Riviera, and for about 10 years.
Yeah. So did you study then technical writing at university
Correct, yes.
Or in French?
In French, yes, in Limoges. So that was back in 2005. So a bit more than 20 years ago.
Okay. And so you've seen, from maybe just out of curiosity, what did you learn to use for technical writing before DITA?
And that's an interesting question. It was the very beginnings of structured content. And so before 2005, we were talking a little bit about SGML. And so at the time, we were using FrameMaker to do some structured documentation with content templates. I will not go too much into details because I think this version of FrameMaker really does not exist in the same way that it used to. So it was a complex thing at the time, but the interesting part is that the person responsible for this training department, technical writing department, created himself a standard for modeling the information. He actually did a thesis on that topic, and he created what was called TIM, Task Information Modeling model. And it allowed ourselves to structure our thoughts into something that was very much task-oriented, which is funny because it is very much what DITA is.
Yes.
And so it was a precursor in that, because 25 or maybe 30 years ago, he put on paper some model, task-oriented model for structuring the documentation for the end users. Very interesting.
And how has technical writing evolved over the years? So starting from this early days of task information oriented modeling and information modeling to what you're seeing today, like you've seen like several of these generations now. What are the interesting things that have changed? And then as a follow-up question, I'll also ask, what are the things that did not change?
The things that have changed, I can see, because I was also a consultant over the years for companies who want to improve their documentation. And I've seen less companies doing Word documentation, because 20 years ago, a lot of companies were doing with what they had, especially small and medium companies. And so that was very often office tools, like Word and Excel, basically. The lucky ones were using FrameMaker, as I was saying. And a lot of companies have been doing documentation with FrameMaker in the past. And what has changed is that I think more and more vendors integrated XML and especially DITA in their capabilities. And so I think for the big groups, big companies have used CMS very early in the days, and also helped the community to grow, because most of the big companies were using a CMS, a DITA CCMS. And for the smaller companies, I think it attracted them to also use that. So maybe not with a big CCMS, because it's a complex and heavy and expensive solution. But there is one tool that very much gathers the DITA community is Oxygen. Oxygen is an XML editor developed by a Romanian company called Syncrosoft, and they participate in the development of the DITA specification. They have the newest DITA version in their XML editor, and it's not only for big companies, but also for smaller companies, because you can do structured content with DITA with just that XML editor and then publish to a website or do your PDFs, for example.
You said like a lot of companies used to just use like word processor or like just document processing technology. Word is like the big one that would stand out. Mm-hmm. It feels like today that is moving more towards Markdown as like the low cost way of doing things. Is that then same old, or do you see a difference between those two approaches?
That's interesting, because the first time I discovered Markdown, that was a long time ago, but I thought to myself, yeah, it's almost like doing Word. And then I started really using it in Access code pipelines and workflows and realized it's completely different. I think the products have changed so much, and the ways of building products and the documentation have changed so much that we cannot really compare those two today. Word is really the document that is very well suited to write a letter to your grandmother, but Markdown is better for being integrated into Access code workflows. If you go to a developer and say, I'm going to have a Word document, can you please integrate that to your development pipelines? It will probably look at you with surprised eyes. Whether if you, of course, use a Markdown document, it will not be surprised, because this is very much tool agnostic, which is not the case of Word. It can be very easily implemented into various workflows or pipelines. So you do not depend on any tool. It's very flexible, very lightweight. And you don't have the semantic layer of DITA, but I don't think we have any interest into breaking the silos there. DITA is very good at what it does.
Yeah.
Very structured, organized chunks of documentation, standardized, and with complex reuse mechanisms. So it's very well suited for high volume of contents that you want to structure. And Markdown is more lightweight, as I said, tool agnostic, and very easy to integrate to development pipelines. So when you do docs as code, it actually comes with the code. It's in the same repo.
Yeah.
So you no longer have this separation of the product and the documentation. Now the documentation is part of the product within the same repository. So it's built with the product. Documentation is built at the same time as the code. And so Markdown is very well suited for that.
To me, it feels like Markdown, yes, it is, because it can be a byproduct of the development process. It's more natural and it can be better integrated. DITA for me, but from what I'm hearing, you're using both in the ANSYS teams. You're using both. You're still using DITA. You're also using Markdown.
Yes.
Like DITA, what is the role that it then plays? Because for me, it feels like DITA is engineered content, is like where there's a deliberate choice that has to be made, where the documentation becomes the product on its own, rather than a byproduct of some other product. And like, how do you use both, and when do you switch?
Yes, those two worlds are very much siloed, and that's why I was saying we are not trying to break the silos. I think there was initiatives in the past to have one tool that fits them all or something like that. I don't think we are trying to do anything like that today. DITA is used for product documentation. We have a lot of documentation and a lot of products at ANSYS. So the volume is very important. We also have strong build pipelines for the documentation based on the DITA Open Toolkit. So then we are able to build the documentation automatically or on demand on a variety of formats. So mainly we deploy on a documentation portal in HTML, where you can, as a user, you can also generate your own PDFs. So of course, starting from, that's what we call single sourcing. So that's from a unique source of documentation. And part of this documentation is translated. So we also benefit from that single sourcing philosophy, I would say. So everything is written once in XML and goes to translation either internally or externally, by the way. And we very much need that constraint formats. I'm using that term constraints on purpose because DITA is constraining the technical writer to write in a certain way. When you're working with a big company, you have 50, 100, sometimes 500 technical writers. And so if you want to be sure your documentation is written consistently, when you have 500 technical writers or even 50 technical writers, you need to follow rules and be constrained in the way you are writing. So you're constraining the types of topics that you can write, or tasks or concepts or reference or troubleshooting topics, for example, but you're also constraining within a topic how you can write a procedure. If you can write a procedure in many different ways, you're losing your consistency. And then sometimes there are, 5 or 10 technical writers for the same product documentation because the product is so big. And so you really need to make sure you bring, as an information architect or as a company, you bring this structure and these constraints to make sure your writers are working the same way with the same philosophy.
Yeah.
With Markdown, there is a little bit of constraints, but not so much. There is, I think the philosophy of Markdown is much more about velocity and rapid deployment, CI/CD. So that's why it's better for adoption from a developer perspective, because a developer doesn't need to add more constraints to what they already have. So they want to do quick documentation that is a little bit structured, but not so much to keep the velocity and the ability to push and deploy the documentation on a regular basis, sometimes several times a day.
Yeah. So it's the level of constraintness, but then those constraints in DITA enable different things than the constraints that you have in Markdown, right? Like how, yes, I'm thinking back to some of the talks that I've seen in Brussels. And like there was one from Ravi and Deepak that I was also interviewing. Probably this will get published before your interview, before this podcast. And they were almost talking about like documentation, almost like a coding, like a natural language code to enable software to execute tasks in a system.
And that was really fascinating because it's not software per se, but it is almost like a coding, or as I said, like it's an engineering artifact that you're creating with technical writers that are really thinking about information, using minimalism to narrow down the scope of the documentation to very specific questions, and then answering those specific questions. And then, so I think we're talking earlier about combining a bunch of topics together into product documentation, where you have a clear map, like using a DITA map, where you have a clear idea of what kind of product documentation needs to be in the documentation deliverable that you're giving with a product. But I feel that there's other ways of using that minimalistic format of the documentation to do more advanced things with it also. Probably not what you want to ask your developers to create, but maybe that is like an additional deliverable that sits on top of what the developers are creating, like with a different purpose. Does that ring any, or does that feel, or how does that feel for you when you hear this? Is that also how you're seeing it?
For me, minimalism is not strictly tied to any language or format or tooling. It's more a philosophy. So I tend to say that you can work in DITA, but not being minimalist at all, being verbose. And so, of course, DITA is a framework that will help you being minimalist, but it doesn't mean it will do it for you. It is really, for me, a different approach and a philosophy that you have to adopt, whichever the tool or the format you're writing in. So you can be minimalistic with Markdown equally as with DITA. DITA will help you in a way that the XML elements, the DITA elements that you use are semantic. It will always guide you through the type of content that you need to write, and usually not more. For example, when you're writing a procedure, do you have a prerequisite? Do you have a step result every time you write a step? Do you have a result to your procedure? And it guides you through the writing mechanisms, and you usually stick to that. So it helps to the minimalism. Writing in Markdown is a little bit different because there are not so much constraints for only having like headings, bullet lists, ordered lists, and things like that. If you want to write more, you just add a new paragraph and it will not prevent you from doing that. So yeah, I think back to minimalism, DITA helps, but it's not forcing you to be minimalistic. That's what I wanted to say.
It's not a complete set of constraints. It enables minimalism, but it does not enforce minimalism.
Exactly. Yes.
You were talking about semantic, like, and you used the word a couple of times. Can you explain what that means in DITA specifically? Like, maybe you gave a couple of examples, but how does it play out in DITA? That it has these semantic tags.
Yes. So DITA is what we call a semantic language or format, because the DITA elements and also the DITA topics, so the types of contents that you are writing, are meaningful. So they provide meaning. So if we start with the types of topics, because that's the bigger type of block, I would say. When you write something, you first have to decide if you want to write this in a topic type, which is the most generic one and not very often used, or a task topic type, or a concept topic type, reference or troubleshooting. There are also companies who are specializing their syntax files, their DTDs, to create more and new topic types. And this is a first step to do semantics, because when you're selecting a topic type, for example, the task that you will write a procedure, you cannot write very specific, very generic conceptual information into a task. It will not allow you to do it. So this is the first step. And then the second step is when you have selected your topic type. So let's go back to this task. The set of elements there that you can select, that you can use, is very much constrained by the DTD. You can, of course, specialize the DTDs, but out of the box, by default, you will only be able to use a certain amount and type of elements. And these elements are providing meaning because, as I said, you're writing steps and step results, and the procedure can have a prerequisite, and the prerequisite has to be written in a specific tag that is prereq. And so there is a correlation between the framework, so the DITA elements that you're using, and the meaning of your sentence. And that's what semantic is.
So DTD that's a way of validating a task or the topic, right?
Yes, it means document type definition, and it's where all the syntax rules are written. Basically, in a tasks.dtd file, you will find rules about how to write your procedures, which elements and attributes, XML elements and XML attributes you're allowed to use or not to use, even how many times you can use an element, stuff like that. So
yeah.
It's very much constraining your writing. Yes.
Yeah. So then it says what's the first elements that you need to start with. So it's a little bit like a form, but like more dynamic. That's correct. Yeah.
It can be flexible if you specialize it. So you always have the possibility to edit your DTDs to fit for example, your industry. So for example, I know industry in pharmaceutics have specialized a lot their DTDs to have elements to write pills documentation or medicine documentation. So there's a flexibility, but once the DTD is written, and if you want to lock its edition for technical writers, then it's locked. So your writers will not be able to go outside of the rules that you've defined. So this is where one of the power of DITA is that you're constraining your many writers sometimes to a predefined set of rules, and they cannot go outside of these rules. And this is where consistency is starting to started.
It enables consistency. So what is that you were saying earlier? So it enables minimalism and it enables like a good way of writing. What is the secret sauce? What's the implicit part that you need to add to the standards to really get to good documentation? Like, I'm sure you've mentored a lot of people and you even taught people how to do this. So what is that secret sauce that you normally help people to find?
For me, that starts with knowing the products that you're documenting very well and have a great collaboration with subject matter experts. Because you can be a DITA expert if you don't know your product, what you will be writing will not have a great value. So it really starts by having a great collaboration with subject matter experts, extracting the value of their knowledge about the product and transforming this knowledge into something that is DITA compliant in a way, and at the end of the day, better for the end user and the customers that are reading the documentation. Because once you have extracted this knowledge, your role as a tech writer, especially as a DITA tech writer, is to translate the raw language of the SME into a language that the end user is able to understand easier.
Yeah. And so then the raw, like having the relationships with the SMEs and being able to understand them is like one piece. Knowing your audience is the second piece?
Yes, of course. Because again, if you're writing good documentation, but it's not what the audience is looking for, it's completely useless. So it has to be corresponding to what your audience is expecting. And knowing your audience is not an easy task because it can be very narrow in terms of persona. So it can be one persona. For example, you're doing a software for, optical engineers, and they all have the same kind of knowledge. But when you are doing a software and a software documentation that is dedicated to, for example, cloud users or cloud engineers, then there can be many personas. And then their level of expertise, their expectations are completely different. And so you have to adapt your documentation accordingly. And that's the other power of DITA is conditionality and the fact to be able to make the output vary. Like you can publish many flavors of your contents depending on your audience, but also on many other things. And so once you have created variations of your contents or conditionality, you can say, I want to publish for this type of audience or this other type of audience in one go, in one click. So that is also one of the power of using this content framework is to make the documentation really tailored to a specific audience.
So then practically, how does that work? Do you work with your colleagues on personas, and do you regularly review personas, or how can I imagine that?
So yeah, you usually get closer to someone who is close to the customer. It can be someone from the support or from pre-sales or post-sales. So someone who knows customers and their expectations. And so this person is part of the SMEs you're working with. The technical writers are working with a lot of persons in the company, and not only on the technical side. So it's also interesting to have discussions with sales or support colleagues to know what the customer expectations are and to write the contents accordingly. And then those persons can also be in the review loop of the documentation to make sure your documentation is actually bringing some value to every persona that has been identified. Yes.
But then it is also like a lot of jobs. It's about perspective taking, basically, like being able to put yourself into the shoes of somebody else.
Yes. Yeah, that's, I think, one of the qualities of a technical writer. There are many required, but one of those is to really be able, as you said, to put yourself in the shoes of the person who is going to consume your contents, to imagine their journey with the content, what their navigation could be, and to really anticipate any of their needs. So put yourself in their shoes, do some random navigation and imagine, okay, I'm on this topic. What is going to be my journey? Which topic should I link to make sure the user journey is as smooth as possible?
Yeah.
It makes me think that one of the technical writer role is also to do that on the UI of the software if you're doing software documentation. So if, for example, you have an error message popping up on your UI, on your software, you really have to work with the developer first to write the message, but also to recover from that message. And then that's also one of the principles of minimalism, is to avoid writing a lot of contents, designing the product better, because if the product is perfect and you know how to use it very intuitively, you don't need documentation.
Yeah.
And that's something I very much adhere to, even if I used to be a writer. I think it's better to provide an intuitive interface rather than writing hundreds of pages to explain a very bad interface. So having a good error message, for example, or even better, avoiding the error message is the first step. And then if you cannot avoid it, really explain why you have this message and how to recover from it very easily. That's an important also role of the writer.
And DITA allows you to even take the microcopy from your product and make it part of your documentation. So that's, I don't know if I've seen people talk about that. I don't know if you apply that. Do you have that kind of binding between the product and the documentation?
I know there are initiatives in that direction. I've never done that myself, but I know it's possible, yes.
Yeah. So that the copy that is coming on the labels is also like the job of the documentation people, or it's all a bit, the boundaries are a bit fluid between UX, UI, and tech write in those cases. But yeah.
Yeah, a good practice is to, for example, have a common database between what the developer will be using in terms of iMessages and what the writer will be using in its documentation. So when one is changing, if the developer wants to change the message or if the writer wants to improve it, it's changing on both sides. Yeah. That's one of the good practices. Yeah.
And how do technical writers navigate the inside out versus the outside in mindset? So we're talking about perspective taking. It's actually really important to be able to understand the internal domain language that an organization has developed to talk about something. But then it's also important to be able to take the perspective of someone who does not know that domain language. Like, how do people go about that typically?
I'm not sure if that's going to answer the question, but it's true that we very much go from an inside-out documentation deployment with a company delivering content to their customers, and sometimes without knowing very well if that is going to be useful or not, to an approach where we really need to understand better what the customer's needs are by better knowing them and provide some use case-oriented documentation. I think now we have with AI, but I think we are going to also talk about this a little bit. We are really able to improve our productivity as a writer, but also our capacity to better understand what our customers are expecting from us from a writer perspective. Because One of the things I realized recently is that AI makes the boundaries between roles in the company lighter, because when you're a technical writer, for example, it's quite easy to go to an LLM and ask it, give the context and ask it, please, or you don't have to say please, by the way, explain me what an optical engineer is doing and expecting from a documentation of this product, for example.
Yeah.
And where in the past you had to find an SME to have this answer and maybe part of this answer, because there was always a little bit of bias. Now I'm not saying the answer will be better. Sometimes it will be, sometimes not, but at least you can have it instantly and you can challenge the LLM with more questions. And so you can really have this context brought to you instantly and write your content accordingly. And so if you want to create use case documentation that answers a specific need of a specific audience, now you have all the keys to do it, while in the past it was very difficult.
It's this helping people to take different perspectives. So like by challenging the perspective or by helping you to break out of your perspective, that is key power.
Yeah, probably. I think we should always, of course, keep the human in the loop to make sure we're not just making several LLMs to speak to each other by hallucinating a lot. But yeah.
It's this using LLMs not as a writing tool, but as a translation tool. I think that is like, yes, you can use LLMs to create summaries. Yes, you can get like a first idea for a draft. But if you treat it as a truly intelligent system, then you're going to mess up. I feel that a lot of the work in working with AI is to go against the hype or the false promise of AI. It's like when the industry that is making AI is telling us that it is intelligent, but actually it isn't, or it's not. Is that misperception that makes people make mistakes in how they use AI. Probably would be healthier if it is what it is, and it's very useful technology, but it's the perception of what it can do that is very much shaped by the labels that people are using for it, that is actually making it harder to use it correctly, I feel. Yeah.
It's probably because we are at the beginnings of it, even if we feel like it's been a while, and it's been a few years that we're using AI, but I do feel like it's just the beginning.
Yeah.
And when agentic AI, or probably some other forms of AI that we don't know yet because we don't know what we don't know. And so when this will be widely adopted by single users, when it will be easier to create agents or master agents that control sub-agents, maybe you'll just become an operator of agents that do most of your tasks for you. That's what I mean, a little bit like in the past, we used to have a lot of humans doing a lot of difficult tasks in factories, and then progressively machines have appeared, and progressively humans disappeared from factories, except one person who is controlling and operating the machines and making sure they are operating correctly, or in case one is failing, they will just push a few buttons to make it work again. And I don't know if that's the direction we're taking, but I don't think it's completely insane to think that we are going to operate the same way with computer engineering at large. And maybe not all of the jobs, but some of the jobs will go in that direction of becoming an operator of agents who are doing the tasks for you.
Yeah, I think for me, there's a big parallel with the constraint systems. Like the same way that DITA is a constraint system that enables you to create better minimalistic content. I think that we need these constraint systems around AI to enable them to be predictable and to be actually functional in specific outcome industries. And I feel that like creating those constraint harnesses is, I think, what is happening right now. That is like the big work that needs to happen for making this technology actually to help in creating productivity gains.
And that's why we have to be very much aware about the fact that technical writers do not write for end users who read their documentation directly.
Yeah.
Yes, a little bit, but not only. We also write for LLMs that digest the content and that deliver it to the same end users who are reading the LLM response to their question. And so that's a shift in the paradigm. And when we know that, we also need to make sure what we deliver on our documentation portals, for example, is LLM-ready. And to be LLM-ready, it has to provide the context, the intent, and a lot of other metadata that we are not necessarily having in our contents today. If you ask a technical writer, do you have metadata in every one of your topics in your content chunks? The answer will probably be no, or not enough.
Yeah.
And I think we need to go more in this direction to not only provide the how, but also the why, and to make sure the LLM is considering the context of your documentation, the level of expertise, the audience, the intent, etc. That is very important.
Yeah, and that is, it just feels like an enormous amount of content engineering work that needs to happen, like a whole new set of professions that almost need to be invented. Like there is the seeds of how to do this work. The seeds are already there, but there's like a different way of creating content, I think, and also systems for creating that content that needs to be invented, I feel.
Yes and no. It's difficult to predict, but I feel like DITA already provides a framework that works in this direction because it already contains sections and elements for providing metadata. There is even a tag called context. So you see that we could use that, for example. It's maybe not as true for Markdown. We have the ability to provide metadata in Markdown headers, of course.
Yeah.
But I don't think there is a way to constrain it, unless I'm mistaken. In DITA, you can very much constrain that and standardize it. So you'll make sure you end up with every topic, every chunk of content being populated with metadata and LLM ready for consumption. I feel it's probably not a shift into the technology, but rather a shift into how the technical writer approaches his content delivery. Because as I said, we are no longer writing only for end users reading directly the documentation.
Yeah. And I see two different AI personas. So I see an internal one that is adjusted to your internal systems, that knows your domain model, that knows your metadata model, that can reason over your knowledge graph that you have as an organization. And then I see external AI persona, which is basically using the open web and your documentation that is published in the open web as a sort of semantic cache that helps us to take shortcuts to specific outcomes using what is already incorporated in the model and what is in the index that is being generated over the internet, and like the index that it has to be reasoning with, to take a shortcut towards a specific outcome, but like a guess what the way Google search works. So there's this deliberate AI, and then there's this serendipitous AI kind of bifurcation where I cannot imagine that, at least right now, I can't imagine that like there is a need for content before you have made a choice to work with a specific organization. And that, because that content is, it's about domains. Like, so inside of your own domain, you can specialize the tools to your domain. Outside of your domain, be that your organizational context, or even outside of your industry context, you don't have that domain scaffold to help with the reasoning. So it is more open-ended. And I think that this is the split between where you use Markdown and where you use a much more structured language. So like inside of your domain, you ideally use a highly structured, highly semantically meaningful way of writing. Outside of your domain, when you're publishing to the open web, where wild AI bots roam that don't know your context, you use Markdown, because there you can reduce the token count of your content by using Markdown, because it's like super low token content. Is that also what you're seeing, or how does that feel?
I think what we often see is companies doing all of their product documentation with XML architectures, mainly DITA, because it provides the mechanisms to do some complex, high volume, highly reusable, conditionality ready documentation. And when they want to do lighter documentation that is with more velocity within CI/CD context, for example, very much talks as code. And so since here we are talking about API documentation or developer documentation, it is what it's all about. And I don't think developers want to bring more complexity to their pipelines by adopting the DITA framework with everything that is behind, like the open toolkit to build the documentation, all the CSS, all the files, the syntax files, etc., that are needed to build your documentation. So Markdown is very lightweight and brings a lot of velocity to their workflows because it's very close to the code and it goes with the code. So when they build the code, it builds the Markdown for documentation automatically. And it very much made the collaboration between the documentation team and the developer teams easier. There is, I think, less friction points to this collaboration by using Markdown because it's something that brings no constraints to your tooling or to your workflows. It's just a file or a set of files that are there. You don't need any specific tools to write Markdown or to deploy it. So yeah, it's reducing the friction points, I think, is key when developers want to code and especially to deploy fast and with a high cadence.
But it's this. There's this split between authoring and publishing, because I think this I think was missing from my statement, or it was not a real question. Is so authoring Markdown makes sense. Docs codes makes sense. We've seen it. The industry has adapted it big time because it's what you just described. But what I also see, like, for example, we're doing experiments with Markdown response headers so that we can take an HTML page that's published on the open web, and like when an LLM comes and requests the content, and responds with Markdown instead of with the HTML. And then you strip out all these tags that are increasing the token count and reduce it to just the language, just the words that are in the content. That reduces the bandwidth and the amount of tokens that you'll need to consume to be able to process the information. So there's like this going from unstructured to structured to unstructured. And I'm saying unstructured Markdown is not unstructured. There is some structure, it's just light on structure.
But I see what you mean,
yeah. And yeah, because I'm trying to find out like what is I feel that there is a use case for both. And I think that like when you have an AI system, like when it's a public AI system that is not yet specialized to your specific usage of structured information, although that with standards you can probably get around some of this, then you might be better off with going to like the low token count information, less semantics in the structure of the information, more semantics in just the text so that you can process it, because you're going outside. So if you're crossing the boundaries of your domains where people don't understand what are tasks, probably this is something that we could bring into the models, and I think the models do understand DITA, but
Yes.
But like those specializations, or if you're not really sure yet what company you is going to be able to help you solve a specific problem, then I think that having this lower count might be more beneficial. Then once you know where you're going, it's like this difference between exploring and executing. So like the exploratory AI, which is about comparing information and trying to figure out, okay, what is this and where should I take you as a user? I think that's the like less semantically encoded information might be useful. But then when you're more deliberately exploring, where you're actually doing semantic reasoning about the information that you have, is this the context that I'm supposed to be using this information in? What is the relationship of this product with its features? What are those features? What are the affordances that those features give me? Like when you're actually doing this reasoning, yeah, there's this different mode. And I think this is also how we as humans work. There's this inspiration, exploration kind of mode. And then there's a reasoning mode where we're really thinking through how something works, and where we're like very consciously thinking, okay, does this logically make sense? I think there's maybe these two modes also that we need to build for AI. And maybe those are the two types of content or the two types of modes. So the more intuitive, in the flow, just give me the information so that we can move on and that it's actually documented. That's like the Markdown version. Or just give me the information so I can look for what is the right thing to work with. That is the like the Markdown publishing version versus the, okay, now tell me what is the step I'm supposed to take right now, and don't give me anything else, but give me every detailed instruction for doing this step. Then you're going to this highly structured information. I don't know. This is what or what you were talking about, what it made me think about.
It very much highlights the importance of not only writing what the users needs, but also everything that is around for the LLM to understand the whole context with metadata. In Brussels, we have heard about this standard iiRDS. Not a specialist, but I understand that it provides a way to standardize the metadata that you provide, and that can be given to an MCP server, for example, and then very much standardized so that different systems from different ecosystems can talk to each other using the same language because it relies on a standard. And so it will, I'm not sure exactly how the technical writer is going to put that to life, but I'm pretty sure this is going to be one of the next major changes for writers, is to make sure their content is metadata rich, and not only rich, but also standardized, because if your metadata is created differently every time you write something, or because you're in a team of 10 technical writers and everybody is using inconsistent metadata logic, it will not work. So I think this iiRDS standard is probably going to help the writers in the future to standardize the way they are enriching their contents with metadata to make sure the systems, not the humans, but the system will understand their content better.
In your understanding, is iiRDS, is that like an authoring language or it's a transport language? I feel it's, or the way I understood it, it's more of a transport language, like a way to send documentation encapsulate like a PDF. It's like
it's a top layer that will go. And by the way, I discovered there is a DITA Open Toolkit plugin for iiRDS.
Yeah.
So when you publish, you have this set of files that are created automatically, including an RDF file, which contains structured metadata. So I don't know exactly how to answer this question, but it definitely creates a set of files on top of your content files that the systems, including the LLMs, will know how to read and to interpret, and finally to give the user a better answer, because they will have more context, they will know how to know how the things are interconnected, etc.
Yeah, because it's interesting. DITA Open Toolkit used to be mostly about combining your chunks into it's so funny. DITA even talks, chunking has always been there. And DITA Open Toolkit was about combining chunks to create a publication. But now LLMs need chunks to be able to process them, because otherwise the context window is too large. So yeah, it's really interesting how DITA was just really made for this moment.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Is there anything we were talking about? So we've gone from DITA versus Markdown. How does it work? Actually, we haven't talked about like what is the business that ANSYS is in, and the larger Synopsys merger. Or can you maybe explain a little bit about the company you work for?
So ANSYS is a software company that is designing applications to help simulation engineers in every vertical of physics vertical, I would say. We address solutions for mechanical engineers, but also fluids engineers, optical engineers, electronics engineers, etc. ANSYS has thousands and thousands of customers in every possible industry. And as you said, last year, Synopsys has acquired ANSYS. Synopsys is an actor of the EDA business, so that's electronic design automation. So they basically provide solutions to enhance how the silicon is designed. So the silicon is the chips, and the chip systems are designed. chips are smaller and smaller, and though they are more powerful every day, I think we doubled the power and the capabilities of chips every 2 years while reducing the size of the chip systems. And so the acquisition of ANSYS is really to go from, as they say, from silicon to systems. So they really want to understand the electronic design within a system, for example, within an autonomous car, to build not only the different parts, but also the interconnections between every electronic part, and how this all works, and how to optimize this, the way it works system, whether it's a car or a plane or whatever. So it's interesting to see that the combined company, Synopsys and ANSYS, has, I think, 200 plus different software. It, of course, means a lot of documentation, probably a variety of tools and formats used with the combined company. So the challenge now will be to see how we can work together and select the best of our two worlds. Yeah.
And I think it's a really powerful acquisition or a combination, because like right now, when people are getting very excited about world models, like modeling software, I think, is becoming more and more important. I can imagine, maybe, I don't know, I haven't read this in any of the materials, but I could, for example, imagine that you're creating like specialized silicon to help embody specific modeling algorithms or things like that. And so it's going to be very exciting to follow the acquisition and how the joint company evolves. Like, and yeah, from what I was excited to read about when I went looking, there's like several. So just the acquisition of ANSYS was a major acquisition. I think several $1 billion.
35, I think.
Yeah, 35
billion.
So it's a huge acquisition. Similarly, also NVIDIA has been investing in Synopsys. You're like smack in the middle of like these transformations that are happening because of AI. And then also, yeah, these modeling software pieces that are potentially helping to enable AI to do more interesting things, more in a more predictable way, or with less hallucinations, let's say, like that. So that's going to be very exciting to follow how the company evolves.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to work for a large group, because we do have dedicated AI teams, of course. So we have our own AI tools and technologies emerging, and we feel like we are part of the story, because we are helping to shape the future, mostly with those AI capabilities. Very exciting.
Maybe as a wrap up, is there something, Paul, that you would like people to go and have a look at, or something that you would like to share with the world that could help you in your mission? I don't know. Are you hiring tech writers, or are you looking for something specific?
Yes, that's a good idea, actually. I'm very much a DITA person from my early ages in technical documentation, but we've built a very interesting developer portal for ANSYS. So if you go to developer.ansys.com, you will see that there is a quite big documentation section, and everything here under the hood is Markdown. So we have built standardized pipelines to extract contents from the various teams that we have and that we work with, and we standardize all of those contents to Markdown before publishing them to the portal. So there's a lot of library and API documentation there. So I will encourage everybody to have a look at this portal and see that with Markdown, we can also have very well structured contents, clean contents. And even if we don't have the complex reuse mechanisms or conditionality that we can use with DITA, we can do very interesting work, and being very flexible and very much continuous CI/CD approach compliant with the various development teams that we are working with.
Yeah. And so just go have a look at the portal, and also probably if people want to reach out to you, they can find you on LinkedIn.
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm trying to post every now and then on some topics. Just feel free to reach out to me. Just type my name and you will find me. I don't think there is any Paul Coinaud in the world.
Okay, then thank you very much for coming on and for the conversation, for explaining the world of DITA and how it plays out against Markdown, and when Markdown is a better fit. And yeah, we are in touch, and thank you for coming to the show.
Thank you, Christoph. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode. This episode of the Resilience Podcast was brought to you by Pronovix. You can learn more about our company at pronovix.com, and thank you for listening.